Welcome to the Mission Books podcast, where we talk to authors about important books related to missions. And today we have special guest, Yvonne Huneycutt. Yvonne, welcome. And would you introduce yourself to people?
Hi, Brad. Yes, I am so thrilled to be with you today. I live in Austin, Texas. Well, actually Round Rock, which is just north of Austin, with my husband, Steve. And I've been involved in ministry, I guess, since college days when I started in youth ministry. I've been involved with the Perspectives movement for about 35 years, a little more. And it's just been a joy for me all these years to work with Perspectives, both with US Perspectives USA, but also Perspectives Global. And Perspectives Global is the organization that helps support national Perspectives programs around the world. And we also come alongside national leaders to help them get programs started in new nations and new languages.
Great. Now, for those of you who know the term perspectives, you go, I think I know what that is. Let me just tell you what she's referring to. The whole course is called the Perspectives on the World Christian Movement. And it's really a transformative study program designed to inform and engage believers in for God's really ancient and global purposes. It's a 15 lesson course exploring four perspectives in God's mission: biblical, historical, cultural, and strategic. And the curriculum consists of readings from biblical scholars and missiological leaders, and it's taught by instructors and has readings from people who have experience, expertise in the subject matter. So it can be taken for non-credit or for undergraduate credit, graduate credit. So anyhow, it has over 300,000 alumni. So when she says perspectives, you're wondering, what does that mean? That's what she's referring to. And chances are, if you are interested in missions, you've heard of the Perspective movement. You probably, have the workbook. You probably read through it. So we're talking to Yvonne today because she has written a book called Propelled by Hope. And it's basically looking at the history of perspectives and its impact and whatnot. But I'll let Yvonne really say more of that so I don't misrepresent anything. So Yvonne, introduce us to the book. Why did you write this book? And how have you been involved in perspectives?
Okay, well, I'll first start with me. I first took the Perspectives course post-seminary after my Master of Divinity. And when I was in this course, I was just blown away by what I was hearing. And I'd grown up in church all my life, and mission-minded denomination, of course, great seminary. But I was seeing things in a new light, a new perspective, if you will, that I had not seen before in the scriptures, understanding of God, understanding myself, my role in the world, God's purposes. And that was just completely life-changing for me, and also in the trajectory of my ministry. And so I became involved first with Perspectives in doing what most people do, being part of a coordinating team and then coordinating classes. I eventually went on staff with the U.S. Center for World Mission, which is today Frontier Ventures. And I did so in order to mobilize my hometown, where I was living, Nashville, Tennessee, into mission, and worked with them, worked in Nashville and mission mobilization for about a little over a decade, and was just amazed and just the thrill of watching so many people from so many churches and denominations and schools see their lives transformed. And in fact, we saw over 100 new missionaries come out of the Perspectives course over the decade. And so that just impacted me personally. I have had a life of working both in the corporate world with nonprofits, church ministry. So I've only been on staff with Frontier Ventures or Perspectives for about a decade of my life. And I eventually ended up teaching around the U.S., teaching internationally, training, writing for Perspectives, and then eventually joining Perspectives Global staff so we can help help see programs started internationally. And so why did I write the book? So I was working on my doctoral program at Gordon Conwell Theological Seminary, and one of my projects was it was a DMin, and one of my projects was related to looking at the history section of the Perspectives course, because that's one of the big sections. And in doing so, I had to write a little bit about what is Perspectives, what is its history. And my doctoral mentor at the time was Dr. Timothy Tennant, who is now president of Asbury Seminary. And when I wrote this paper about the history of Perspectives, which is just a small piece of what's in the book today, he's strongly encouraged me, Yvonne, you need to put this in print. And I realized there was in my research, there was no history written about Perspectives, this transformational movement that's around the world. It had never been recorded. So at least in a book, just a little article here and there. So that's why I did it.
No, I'm glad Dr. Tennant said that. That's yeah. I went to Gordon Conwell too, and he's a wise man. So good advice. So let's jump into the content of the book.
Okay.
Why was the Perspectives course created? What was the catalyst for it?
Okay, the catalyst was actually something that was very surprising and unexpected at the day. Perspective started in 1974, was the very first class, but I need to back up before 1974 just a little bit to explain why it even began and give a little historical and sociological context to it. So back in the 1960s, early 70s, you had a youth generation that was growing up, coming of age during the Vietnam War, during the Woodstock age of drugs, sex, and rock and roll. You had a generation that was pretty much, there was a lot of drug addiction and a lot of rebellion, a lot of student protest on campuses. So that was all going on. And just as kids then were turned on to drugs, they were also turned off to anything institutional, and that included church admission. And so not only was church attendance dropping, but you also had a great decline in volunteering to become missionaries. And this was reflected at the Urbana Mission Conferences. The Urbana Mission Conference is a large U.S. student congress. It's held every 3 years. And so student response to the call to mission had greatly, greatly dwindled. And then the wind of the Holy Spirit started moving across this youth generation, and kids started leaving their drugs behind, their rebellion behind, and turning to Jesus, and their lives were being transformed. And in the process, unexpected to anybody, they started developing an interest in mission. It was reflected at Urbana 73. And so at Urbana 73, when the call was given to the students there, if you want to surrender your life to Christ, to however God might want to use you in the world and in mission, sign these commitment cards. Or first they ask them just to stand up. And so many students stood up at Urbana 73 that the leaders thought that, oh, they must not understand. So they had them all sit back down. And they made the call even harder. And even more students stood up. And when that happened, they realized things have radically changed here. And so Dr. Ralph Winter was at this Urbana 73 Congress, and he left thinking these kids' commitments are going to wane if it's not sustained with something, and it needs to be informed. And so he went through a lot of steps I talk about in the book of how he put together this course for these Urbana students in the summer of 1974. And it was held at Wheaton College. It was a summer-long course, and that was the forerunner to the very first Perspectives course. And so we've been building and changing and shifting ever since that time, but that was the initial impetus for Perspectives.
Wow, it's such a cool story to hear. Make it even harder, and people say, yes, count me in. That's amazing. So this year is the 50th anniversary for the Perspectives movement, but it's also the 50th anniversary for the Lausanne movement.
Right.
And you do get to get this, you do flesh this out in the book, but could you tell people how those two movements, Lausanne and Perspectives, how they've influenced each other over the past 50 years?
Oh, sure. Well, the key catalyst, of course, is Dr. Ralph Winter. Dr. Ralph Winter was asked to deliver a plenary talk at the Lausanne. It was the first International Congress on World Evangelization in 1974 in Lausanne, Switzerland. We just call it today Lausanne 74. And so he was asked to give a plenary talk, and he'd been working on it and came by the very first, what we'll call perspectives class. It had a different name at the time, but the very first perspectives class there at Wheaton College. And he talked with the students there about what he was going to be saying, which was going to be a radical challenge. And he even had an engineering student there, Bruce Graham, draw up charts, graphs, so that he could present the challenge he was going to give to the Congress. And so then he went on to the Congress, and it's kind of like the rest is history. The plenary address he gave was just a game changer in the world of mission. He introduced the whole concept of unreached people groups and challenged the global and church leaders that were there from around the world that we need to focus upon the peoples that have yet to have access to the gospel. We've been looking at geopolitical nations. We need to shift our focus to cultural, ethnic groups, language groups, and there's so many more of them. And the only way the gospel is going to really go into these people groups is going to be if we have intentional church planting movements, intentional sending of missionaries first, just to these unreached peoples. And so that wasn't the term he used at the time, but that became the term unreached peoples. And so that was the beginning of Lausanne in 1974. It was also the beginning of Perspectives. And over the years, these two movements have grown in tandem with one another. And as Lausanne focused on the frontiers of missions, Perspectives was teaching about that. And so many trends, I talk about numerous trends in my book that began to happen in missions and the way missions changed over the next several decades. And so how these two movements worked together was that many of these trends were already being taught in Perspectives. Things like, I'll just give you an example, business as mission. Nobody ever even thought about that. That was not a deal, it wasn't an idea. And yet there was an article in the first Perspectives about business people going with their skill sets with business and doing among unreached peoples. And so Perspectives was introducing some trends. Many of those Perspectives alumni were graduating. They were becoming influencers in mission agencies. Some were starting their own mission agencies. And so they were feeding into this frontier mission movement. While at the same time, Lausanne, through its writings, its papers, its global meetings and networking, was feeding back into Perspectives. And we were learning from one another. And still to this day, our Asian director for Perspectives, who's also the director of Perspectives Korea, Chul-Ho Han, he is on the convening committee of Lausanne 50th anniversary celebration in South Korea. So we're still closely connected in that way.
So the overlap, the symbiotic relationship is frontier missions.
Yes.
So even though the title of the book is about the story of Perspectives movement, you give over actually 1/4 of the book to talking about the development of frontier missions. So what are some ways that global missions has changed over the past 50 years?
Well, I would say first and foremost would be the emphasis on taking the gospel where it doesn't currently exist, the whole focus on unreached people groups. That was a significant shift in way missions was thought about, way the strategies that were being developed, where the sending was going to over the next couple of 3 decades. So that was a major one. But then another huge shift was the shift of the global church. So in those last 2 to 3 decades of the 20th century, there was a massive shift of the bulk of the church itself is to be found what we would call the global south. It's to the south and the east of our globe. Others might refer to it as the 2/3 world or the non-Western world. And so as the church shifted, where the bulk of the church was in the global south, so did mission sending begin a robust sending from the global south. And when you have that, then you have to talk about partnership and how do we work together in partnership. So there was a lot of emphasis on equipping on how does the global north, the global south work together in partnership. So that was one of the trends and the emphases. New ways of sending would be another. I already mentioned like business as mission, but there was church sending. Churches started sending as well as mission agencies. We take short-term missions for granted today, but that was a new trend coming up in the 1980s, as and it began to proliferate. So new ways of sending, new partnerships, new research on all kinds of research on the world and on unreached peoples. And so that really fed into that, as well as new strategies, new specific focal points of sending. So you start seeing mission agencies, instead of being generalized, they might be focused on, say, Muslims or Hindus or nomads or urbanites, or a particular people group. And then you see mission agencies spring up that had new technologies or skills like ethnomusicology or mobile media, these sorts of things. All this was just proliferating at the end of the last millennium and continues to this day.
So it sounds like that it's really hard sometimes to cross over denominational barriers, traditional barriers, but somehow Perspectives has managed to do precisely that.
Oh, yeah.
Can you attribute that to anything, that somehow Perspectives has been able to bridge that gap and bring people together in a way that other initiatives maybe haven't?
Well, there's an intentionality for one. We just follow the Lausanne doctrine theologically. So if we're in community on that, it can attract all kinds of denominations, mission agencies, and that sort of thing. But with the way Perspectives are held, they're held within cities. And so there's an intentionality to bring together churches of multiple denominations, representatives from different types of organizations, agencies, student groups, this sort of thing. So it was a very intentional thing. And then we also intentionally do not try to promote any particular bend, theological bent or sort of thing. So we try to keep it as neutral as possible, and it has attracted many people in that way. And it's flourished in many different organizations or denominations. I mean, I'll just give you, for instance, this is just this last week, I've been collecting some information for our 50th anniversary of Perspectives, and just received a report from Nigeria. And it was about how the Anglican Church in Nigeria, which is the largest church in the entire Anglican Church in the world, and an evangelical church, and how Perspectives started from the top down with them, with the patriarch, like the archbishop, I guess you would say, of in Nigeria, was so impacted by Perspectives over 20 years ago. He just wept and said, all my priests, all my bishops have to have this. And it started a ball rolling, so that now bishoprics throughout different portions of Nigeria are having all their priests trained in Perspectives. And many of them now, instead of saying, no, 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 don't send me to the rural areas, don't send me to the north where the Muslims are now saying, please send me, because I want to have an impact for the kingdom of God where the gospel has never gone before.
No, that totally makes sense. And as I think through the contributors to the Perspectives course, you really have people across the denominational spectrum, and it's really balanced. Like I said, you have biblical writing, historical, cultural, strategic practitioners. So it really does focus really on missions, which is anybody in the church can get on board with, whatever other disagreements someone may have. Yeah. Now, I imagine most people in our audience are familiar with Perspectives course to some degree. So, in your research of the history, what are maybe some surprising elements that you've uncovered? Any good stories?
Yeah. So when I first started my research, I conducted over 60 personal interviews to produce this book. And I specifically wanted to focus on the founders. In fact, I had a great sit-down interview with Dr. Ralph Winter before he passed away for about 3 hours. A good sit-down interview similarly with Steve Hawthorne, who thankfully is still living with us, and other founders and leaders of that early Perspectives movement. And what really impressed me that I wasn't aware of was there was this strong sense of another student volunteer movement happening. Now, what is the student volunteer movement? It was a great turn of students towards mission back in the early part of the 20th century. Tens of thousands of students ended up going into foreign mission back at that time. So it was a massive movement of students to mission. And then it dwindled off in the middle of the 20th century and so forth. And so here we are in 1974, and the Holy Spirit was moving across this generation of students with the Jesus movement, which is what we call it today, in the early 70s. And then they start turning towards mission. There was this sense among the founders and leaders that this could be another student volunteer movement. Maybe this is what's happening. And so that was interesting to see that that was a big motivator in the early students that were part of this, as well as leaders. The other thing that really, really impacted me as I did my research, which eventually ended up global research, all the places where we have perspectives, which has been booming in other lands, is the depth of the transformative impact and the breadth of it over 50 years. And because we are a volunteer movement, we are almost completely made up of volunteers who just give their time to run Perspectives courses. There is a staff, there are staff people, but most all those people raise their own support just for the privilege of working with Perspectives. So it's essentially a volunteer movement. And it's a transnational movement now, transcultural, transdenominational, multilingual, polycentric. You know, there is no one controlling organization, some international office telling everybody what to do or funding it. I mean, this is a miracle that this course has not only survived, but has more than thrived. It continues to grow and make transformation around the world. You know, how is that even possible? You can't explain it humanly. And there was never a like 10-year plan, 20-year plan. We will be here by now. I mean, most of Perspectives histories you'll read about in the book, we were always like little hamsters trying to catch up to what God was already doing. And so this is just a God story. There's no way to explain it except God. And that was really one of the deepest impacts for me as I did my research.
Yeah, as I kind of listened to you talk about the student movement and this, and then even as I think about around 2000 with the passion movement, there is a pattern of students that's where the kindling happens. There's flexibility there. There's people able to have vision, right? But you're hitting on also another aspect is this decentering of decentralization of leadership. Did you pick up on any ways that this decentering has been able to perpetuate? Because as we know with organizations and movements, they don't tend to remain decentered. They tend to get more and more control and centralized. Any wisdom that we can glean from that, from the Perspectives movement on that point?
That is an incredibly good question, Brad. And in fact, as Perspectives Global was really taking off back around 2010, 2012, we get together every 2, 3, 4 years. We call a global huddle. And we had Dr. Todd Johnson, who is quite familiar to so many of our listeners. And he came as one of our speakers, and he told us at the time, he said, what you were trying to do with Perspectives globally, he says, it's just not done. You're trying to do something very, very hard, and that is to be a decentralized movement across multiple languages, cultures, nations, and so forth, and give autonomy to each of these national programs. And so we have Perspectives Bolivia, Perspectives Korea, Perspectives Indonesia, Perspectives Nigeria, these sorts of things, Ethiopia, and they're all independent of one another, yet they're all connected to one another. And we have a global council that makes decisions together about how this movement is going to go forward. What are going to be the protocols? What's going to be the ethics? What are the things that we're all going to agree to? And one of the key things that is by consensus of all is agreeing to the paradigm, which is unique among all mission courses or mission training out there, is the Perspectives paradigm. That's what really causes the transformation. And I really go into a lot of depth of that in the book, is what is that paradigm? How is it different? How did it develop? This sort of thing. But we're all committed to the paradigm no matter what nation we're in. And as Perspectives Global, we are committed to empowering and undergirding them, but not telling them what they need to do. We come together and make those decisions. So how did that happen? I mean, how do we keep it going? It is challenging. I won't lie. It is challenging to work together and to come to agreements, but yet there's such a family. We are a family. We love each other. And so as we get together globally, which we'll be doing in Chicago at the 50th anniversary, that's where the movement moves forward again internationally.
Well, I helped edit the recent Mission Frontiers magazine. We're focusing on perspectives, history. And one of the things that jumped out to me was it seemed to be as much of a motivation to help other people have ownership over the course as it was to get the quote unquote content passed along. If you can distinguish those two. I mean, I know they can't, but there seemed to be as much of an emphasis on we want them to own this and run with it rather than just follow some protocols and procedures and strategies that we give them. That seems to be really key, when you have local ownership.
Absolutely. In fact, we will not work with a nation. I mean, if it's just one or two people saying, oh, we want perspectives, which happens all the time in every nation. It's like someone's taken it and they want to, maybe in the US or maybe somewhere else in Europe or something, and they want to have it in their country. And it's like, well, if it's just one or two, if you get a consensus among have several that represent the body of Christ in different streams or different, denominations, different organizations, and you agree together you're going to own it, then we'll work with you. But we're not doing the work. We're not funding. We're not doing any of that. We'll help you get started, but it will be self-funding. You will learn it yourself. You will teach it yourself. We just train and equip you to start that. So we expect that of any place where Perspectives goes.
Well, you tell a lot of stories in the book about the impact that perspectives had on individuals, churches, nations, so forth. Could you share a couple stories, perhaps, with the listeners?
Sure, I'd love to. So I do have some impact stories, and I think one of the ones that I want to refer to, I'm going to read maybe a paragraph out of it. And this is a story it's personal with me. In fact, a lot of the stories I share with, because Perspectives has impacted so many people and places, a lot of stories I share just come out of my own experience because, that's what I know and was exposed to. But this particular story goes back to when I was working in Nashville, Tennessee, and I trained a new Perspectives coordinator, young couple, John and Cindy, to run a class in Murfreesboro, Tennessee, which is outside of Nashville. And the pastor who wanted to have it in his church is named Jerry Trousdale. Now, many of our listeners might be familiar with Jerry by his books, but at the time, Jerry was a former missionary to West Africa, and he was now pastoring a church in Murfreesboro, Tennessee. And so he wanted Perspectives. And as God would have it, Jerry was at that time hosting a pastor from West Africa by the name of Shodankeh Johnson. And Shodankeh was going to be in the United States for many months because his son was getting a lot of reconstructive surgery from an accident. And so Shodankeh signed up for the Perspectives course along with Jerry. And one of the most wonderful things that we see in Perspectives is how God puts together certain people in the course with some of our instructors that come. Now, if you don't know about Perspectives, we have 15 different instructors for the 15 different lessons, and they may come from different places in the U.S. Here, if it's a U.S. course. And so I happened to have, I was training this new couple, so we'd set up the instructors, and I had David Watson come as one of the instructors. And so David started sharing about a church planting movement that was going on in India and new things he was learning and understanding what we would call today disciple-making movements or church planting movements. And so this so intrigued Shodankeh because he had been a pastor in West Africa and he was running up against barriers, reaching into Muslim communities and other communities that were not churched. And so he asked David, and Jerry did too, asked David to mentor them over a period of time. And as they did, Shodankeh took these new training and understanding of disciple-making movements back to his home country, and he began to implement them. And as he did, he began to see the breakthroughs that he had longed for all that sort of time. So let me just read, if I might, it's okay, one paragraph from the book about what Shodankeh, this is Shodankeh's quote. He said, well, first, the background of that, he said that we would use access ministries, whether it was well digging or education or healthcare or business, these sorts of things to help a community when we went and we'd find out what the need was in that community. So we would come in and we would help them and it would begin to have transformation. And he said 90% of the time, the transformation would lead to a church because all along we're Bible storytelling while we were working with them and building trust and building relationships. And then he said this. He said, prayer is the most powerful and effective access ministry and has caused a cascading event throughout the movement. Through persistent prayer, we have seen very hostile communities opened, unlikely persons of peace identified, and whole families saved. All the glory goes to the Father who hears and answers prayer. Intercession is the undercurrent that supports all we do. We do whatever it takes to get the gospel to the people so Christ is glorified. Our work is never about us. It's about him. We're making him known with a strategic focus on unreached people groups. And Shadake, he's going to be part of our 50th anniversary celebration, speaking on prayer and the strategic importance of consistent and intense prayer to see God open new doors. So as the movement spread that he helped get started, it began to, within 15 years, churches were planted in thousands of communities in 12 nations from this one movement. And Jerry Trousdale likewise went on to become a trainer as well on disciple-making movements. And he said, as I was interviewing him on this, he said that the organization he works with has recorded an average of 28 new church plants every day in the year 2021. And they have teams of indigenous leaders catalyzing movements in 59 nations with multitudes of new believers from various religious backgrounds. And of course, Jerry's written books on that. So one little class in a college town with a newly trained coordinator, and you never know who God puts in those classes, who God sends as instructors, the marriage that happens in that sense, and then what God does through all of that. And these are the kinds of things that we have seen throughout our 50 years of history of Perspectives.
That's fantastic. And I mean, and to our listeners out there, there's more stories like that in the book. And then if you look at the Mission Frontiers magazine, you'll see more of the impact. And so it's time for us to wrap up, unfortunately, but people can read the book. Could you just close with telling people about the conference if they're interested in that?
Yes, sure. So we're having the 50th anniversary of Perspective. It's a great conference in Chicago at Moody Bible Institute. Since Perspective started at Wheaton, Moody was a little bigger for us, so we were just down the road. And Moody has been a supporter of Perspectives for all these years too. And so we're bringing in our international partners all over the world. Everybody's invited. We're going to have, it's July 17 through 20. I hope I got those dates right, but you can go to perspectives.org and look at the information on the conference. I would encourage people to come. I'll be there and do book signing at the William Carey Publishing table there. And I would hope to see some of our listeners there.
Great. All right, everybody, as you can see from behind her, she has the book Propelled by Hope. I think you have in your hand too, don't you? Yeah, so you can pull that up. All right, guys, you can go to William Carey Publishing, missionbooks.org to get your copy. And then, of course, you can go to the conference. Hey, share this interview with other people. If you want to encourage people, you want to inspire people, this is a book for you. Hey, Yvonne, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Brad, and thank you to the audience. It's been a pleasure to be here.
Absolutely. All right, guys, until next time, keep the conversation going.